Good afternoon, everyone. If I could invite you to come in and take your seats, that would be wonderful. We've got a great program lined up for this afternoon and the next day or two, and we welcome you all here. Man, that got quiet. That's almost like church. Okay. Welcome. Welcome to the 2025 CRWUA Conference. I'm Shawcroft, and it's been a pleasure and an honor to serve as your president of the board of the Colorado River Water Users Association over the past 2 years. I also serve as the general manager for the Central Utah Water Conservancy District and the commissioner to the Upper Colorado River Commission in the state of Utah on the river. Thank you for being here. We're thrilled to see you all and grateful that you are here. As we consider the situation that we're in, 2025 was tumultuous for the river and, frankly, for us. I remember being on the river earlier this year, late summer, in the Moab area. And the river that was supposed to normally be about 4,500 CFS was about 2,000 CFS. I think we had to do more paddling than any other time on the river. The interesting thing is there was no sediment in the river. In the heart of the monsoon season, the river was not crystal clear. It's never crystal clear down that low, but certainly there was no sediment in the river, which was quite a stark reality for what I assumed would be the case at that time of year. As the west becomes drier and the water levels decline, we need to find a path forward. Agreement between stakeholders can seem as elusive as the water itself. However, each state is well represented, and I want to express my respect and admiration to my fellow commissioners. Brandon Gephardt from Wyoming, John Ensminger from Nevada, Tom Buchatsky, Arizona, Becky Mitchell, Colorado, J.B. Hamby, California, and Esteban Lopez, New Mexico. And to all of the technical, legal, and other advisors that help the seven of us as we wrestle with issues on the river. Also would like to recognize our federal partners, tribal folks, state, and so many other partners that participate in this great work. We will find a way forward. Serious long-term partners always do, but the path ahead will require us to level up. As we approach a time of change, let's reflect on a few things that we know will stay the same. First, all of us in this room will always be connected by the river. As sister states, tribal nations, the federal government, and partners, we will continue to work together with respect, expertise, and professional esteem. We will meet every challenge every time. Second, each of us will continue to care fiercely and deeply about the health of the Colorado River, the people, cultures, sacred ecosystems, and economies that depend on the river. The landscape that challenged our tribal nations and pioneer ancestors now ask the very best of us. Those who came before us passed down a tradition of vision, stewardship, and innovation. Now it's our turn to step up and craft one for the next generation, utilizing all the skills worthy of the civilization we hope to build. The third factor that will remain the same, the American West, a landscape of inspiration and legend, will always be dry. Even in the best years, our mountains, deserts, and waterways call for wisdom and careful stewardship. Fourth, and I might be biased, but those of you who have devoted your careers and lives to water are among the best people on earth. We will continue to trust you to be responsible, steady, efficient problem solvers. The work ahead will ask the very best of our vision, work, and subject matter expertise. I know we are up to the task. If you're not connected academically, by training, even spiritually, able to give the very best of you, I ask you to quietly consider what you need to do to level up. Fifth, and finally, the Colorado River Water Users Association, now 80 years old, will continue to play a leading role as the forum of discussion, solutions, and friendship. Since 1945, the organization has been a place for members to develop relationships and allow frank discussions on issues confronting the Colorado River. The opportunity for relationship building, fellowship, and honest exchange of ideas is critical. Every one of us in this room share a love for the Colorado River. The river will vary from one season to the next, but our partnerships and problem-solving expertise will remain constant. There are so many rough spots in the river in the upper reaches, but in the lower reaches it all smooths out over time. So it is with us. As the saying goes, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. The speed of our rivers vary, but the waters of the Colorado River Basin certainly go far. And so do we. And that means we work together. We are one basin. I invite all of us to keep walking forward as partners and friends. As I conclude, I want to share some appreciation for folks that have been heavily involved in this conference. The dedicated staff of our program committee, chaired by Bart Lieflein, who have spent many hours, many meetings over several months to prepare our program. Speakers who offer their hard-won expertise, insight, and experience. Their contribution is invaluable. Exhibitors, those who man the booths, offer education, goods and services, and chocolate. Each one of you, I express appreciation, who share what you've learned and pick up new expertise. We've come a long way together, and to quote Robert Frost, we have miles to go before we sleep. Thank you very much for coming. Welcome to CRWUA, and we look forward to a wonderful conference. Thank you very much. At this time, I would like to invite Jimmy Garcia, who's the Vice President of the Jicarilla Apache Nation, to begin this conference with prayer, something, in my opinion, we don't offer frequently enough. So, Jimmy, we look forward to your prayer. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the introduction. Yes, I am Jimmy Garcia, Vice President, Jicarilla Apache Nation. Just first, if you would just bear with me, just like to give you a brief history of our nation. So we're Jicarilla Nation. We are located in central northern New Mexico. We're about 4,000 tribal members. So the Colorado River, Kuan-Li, she runs through the northwestern part of our tribe. And it serves our hub. Our capital is Dulce, New Mexico. That's where I reside. That's where my home is. That's where I'm coming from today. And we are known for our mule deer and our elk. We have the largest deer ranch on the reservation. So the all hunters come out and visit us. We're also known for our baskets. That's where the name Jicarilla comes from. But in my clan, we call ourselves Hazani. It is the people who emerged. That's how we call ourselves for my clan. But I want to do a quick introduction of myself. So I am Sadanjo Gatsa. Let's welcome everybody. Jimmy Garcia, Shiji, Shiabachi Ansi, Shijama Saklan Ansi, Shijani Rhonda Miji, Shima Violet Miji, Shikaye Den Garcia Miji. And like the mighty Colorado River runs, the Jicarilla also run, and I run for the Kichi, that is the Red Clan, that's my mother's clan. So this past year, the Jicarilla Nation, our Water Commission, worked diligently, tirelessly, and they were the recipients of the prestigious Harvard Project Honoring Nations Award. So it's the first of its kind of a water sharing agreement between the Jicarilla Nation and the New Mexico State Interstate Stream Commission and the Nature Conservancy. The Honorary Nations Award is affirmation of tribal sovereignty and the Jicarilla Nation's inherent right to manage our most valuable resource. Our water sharing agreement is a beacon showing that tribally led innovation provides the most durable solutions for water security in the basin. So that is a brief introduction to who I am, where I come from, my tribe. So I will get to the prayer now. Thank you for bearing with me. So if everybody don't mind keeping with Jicarilla traditions, if everyone will please rise. So first, Creator, I want to say thank you for, I first want to say thank you, Creator, to the Paiute tribes whose land we stand on today, whose land this amazing city is built upon. And I want to say thank you to the city of Las Vegas. Thank you to the organizers of CRWUA who did an amazing job again this year. I want to thank the Caesar's Palace for your hospitality. I want to thank all the attendees, everyone here, for all your tireless work and everything you do. Thank you to all the tribes, nations, pueblos. Thank you to all the federal representatives. Thank you to all the states. And thank you to Creator for bringing us all together. I know in my heart that we all want what's best for the river and for our people and everyone who relies on the river. And it's not easy to leave our families and our loved ones, but the work we do here is important. And just remember, we do it for them and for all the users of the Colorado River. And let us have meaningful discussions this week. And let us all have open hearts and minds so that we may find a solution to the water crisis that we are currently in. And that we are all water warriors. And Creator, please let everyone see that Konle, the river, is a living being with a spirit. Konle is our elder, our leader, our teacher, the keeper of our hopes and our future generations and our memories and all our traditions. Creator, we understand people need to make a living, but I ask that we not only measure the river by dollars, but also in blessings. And Creator, I ask that you help us understand that Nigo's son, Mother Earth, has a fever and she needs to rest. Just as our bodies are made of mostly water, Mother Earth's body is made of mostly water. And when we get sick, we rest and we hydrate. And we need to give Nigo's son, Mother Earth, the same courtesy. And we do that by slowing carbon emissions, by continuing to allocate water in a responsible way. And if we do this, Mother Earth will recover. And once again, there will be snow on our mountains, and there will be waters in our lakes and our rivers. And there will be lush forest and abundant wildlife for us all to enjoy. And Creator, I thank you for bringing everyone to CRWUA safely. And we ask that you watch over everyone while they are here, and that everyone returns home to their family and loved ones. And I wish, the Creator, you look upon everybody here in this room. May they all walk in beauty. Ahead, Creator. Shisoye. Thank you all. You may be seated. And I appreciate the time today. And thank you to all my Jicarilla members. Safe travels home.
Thank you, Vice President Garcia, for that beautiful prayer. My name is Bart Leaflang. I work with the CRWUA Program Committee, and I'm thrilled to see all of you here today. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who is Heather Hansman. We're excited to have Heather, and Heather is a best-selling author, and I love the name of this book because it's something that every one of us in here can relate to. And the name of the book is Powder Days, Ski Bums, Ski Towns, and the Future of Chasing Snow. As far as I know, that's one thing that we all do, we're all interested in, especially interested in is chasing snow. So thrilled that Heather has got that book. That's something that we relate to. Heather's also written a book called Downriver. And if any of you, by a show of hands, who's read Downriver? We've got a good group of you out there. That's awesome. Thank you. So Heather wrote the book Downriver Into the Future of Water in the West, and she's got a forthcoming book by the name of Fierce Country, the untold story of 3 women who ignited America's love for the wild. So she's also a contributing editor with Outdoor Magazine and a frequent contributor to publications like the New York Times and the Atlantic. She lives in Durango, Colorado. So today, Heather is going to take us on a bit of a journey related to her book, Downriver. We're excited to hear about this. And she'll talk through some of the complicated truths about the Colorado River. And President Shawcroft talked about that a little bit. There are ample complicated truths. And every one of those truths or complicated issues are all true at the same time. And that's part of what brings us here together, the challenges that we need to overcome, recognizing that every one of those challenges is legitimate and important. So Heather's going to work through a variety of multifaceted elements through her presentation, looking at the future of water in the American West. And she took a unique journey down the Green River, and looking forward to having Heather walk us through this in the first person. So if you wouldn't mind, let's give Heather a round of applause and invite you up to the stage.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Bart, for that introduction, and thanks, Jimmy, for grounding us here this afternoon. I did really appreciate that part about snow in the mountains, so thank you. And thank you all for being here. For me, it's such a privilege and an honor to get to be here with you all this afternoon and to get to learn from you over the next couple days. Like Bart mentioned, I'm Heather Hansman. I'm a journalist and I'm an author. I write about water in the Colorado River Basin, but I'm not going to stand up here today and tell anybody in this room anything you don't already know about that. So instead, I wanted to talk about the hardest part of my job, which I'm guessing is often the hardest part of a lot of your jobs too, and that is getting all the pieces of a story to fit together. I want to talk about a trip I took from the source of the Green River to its confluence with the main stem of the Colorado. That trip became the backbone of Downriver, the book, which is about all the ways that stretch of river is used. And bringing that book into the world taught me a lot about perspective and about all the interwoven streams that make up a river and about how to think about the future. So at this point, you might be thinking, why do I care about stories and storytelling? I manage a water district. Well, one of my favorite lower basin writers, Joan Didion, said, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." And I think that's true. But I also think that we tell ourselves stories in order to make sense of the past and in order to predict the future. And so we can explain ourselves to each other. Stories are how we know historic climate regimes and what grows well and where sacred places are and what river levels are runnable and what our families have done on the land for generations. And it's not just writers like me that are telling stories. I think that kind of narrative work is important, regardless of whether you're trying to craft policy or communicate science or build community consensus. It's really universal. And I also think it's really tricky to do it because humans are tricky and fickle, and because nature is inherently unstable, and because it can feel like the narrative is constantly changing and like the baseline is shifting. So in light of all that, I've been thinking a lot about the theme for this year's conference, which is forging a path forward. To me, that means aligning desire and need and history with reality. And that takes trying to line up stories and honor all of them, even when they don't fit neatly together, and even when they're all true at the same time. So I figured I'd tell you all the story that became Downriver and what I learned along the way of trying to write about that stretch of water, which of course was really writing about people and energy and food and everything else that's tied up in the Colorado River. I want to talk about how I had to crack open my own assumptions and rewrite stories that I'd been telling myself to try to get it right. And I will hopefully give you guys some journalism tips along the way. And so to understand a little bit more about how I think about all that, I wanted to tell you all a little bit more about me and my background. Before I was a writer, I was a river guide. And I don't want to belabor that point too much, because I know that you all had a different river guide who's a way better writer than me up here last year. But I do think that's important, because guiding and river running was my line into caring about rivers and caring about water. It gave me context, and it gave me bias, which we all have, and which I think is important to acknowledge, because it shapes how we think about the river. So let's go back to, say, 2006. I was living in a van down by the river. It wasn't even my van. My mother was incredibly proud of me. But I was a piece of this recreation economy. My work was tied to the river, and so was my community. And although I loved the rafting part of it, as time went on, I started to really love the river itself. I started to pay more attention to what was happening upstream and down, and tracking when we had water and why. I started to understand all the different ways the river was important, aside from just paddling it. And I did that for years until I got hurt, and I decided that I didn't want to live quite so seasonally anymore. So I decided to go into journalism, which is, as I'm sure everyone knows, a famously stable, lucrative, growing profession. And I went to journalism school at CU in Boulder. And I mentioned journalism school in part because it shaped how I looked at the river. I have a slight upper basin bias. And because some of the people that I learned from are in this room today, which is very cool for me. But also really because of what I learned there, which is that at its most basic level, my job as a journalist is to try to find the truth. I learned to check facts, to go to primary sources, to always get more than one side to the story, and to weigh the balance of the narrative so it was fair. Because when you're looking at complicated things, there's rarely just one side to the story. And I also learned to try to look for stories that weren't being told, and voices that weren't being heard, or pieces that were missing from stories that I thought that I knew. As a writer, you're often looking to break stories and trying to connect dots that other people haven't before, to find something untold. Hold, please. So I started reporting and writing about water because it was something that I cared about and that felt important. And the deeper I got into it, the more questions I had. It felt like there were a lot of those stories that weren't being told. There were small ones about local water issues, but it also felt really hard, as I'm sure all of you know, to try to wrap my hands around the big picture of how water was used and managed in the Colorado River Basin, where I was living and spending time on rivers. And I figured that if I was somebody who cared about rivers and had a stake, and I still couldn't understand what was going on, there were probably other people who were confused. It felt like there were pieces missing to the stories I was seeing. So I decided I was going to try and write a piece of that story I couldn't find, about how the sectors of water use did and didn't fit together, and what that currently looked like on the ground. And I'm very happy to talk later about the nuts and bolts of how that all came together, if anybody cares. But I decided the best way to try to write that story was by paddling the whole Green River, which was a river I'd spent a chunk of time on, and a river that I was pretty sure I could paddle all the way through. It also held a lot of the pieces of the pie that I wanted to look at: agriculture and tribal water rights, ecosystem health and history, extraction and recreation, and it felt like a place where there was still some flex in the system. I thought that by looking at how that particular river was used and seeing the actual river, I could understand the tension points over it, that I could see the story by following the river. Okay, quick pop quiz. Does anybody know where this is? Yeah, that's Green River Lakes in Wyoming's Wind River Range. That's the headwaters of the Green. Have folks been there? Have people seen that? Okay, we got a couple. It's incredibly beautiful up there, as you can see, and that's where I started my trip. I actually took this picture the night before I put on the river. I started paddling from that lower lake in that little pack raft you saw a few slides ago, and I ended the trip 730 miles later in Canyonlands National Park, where the Green meets up with the main stem of the Colorado. I didn't paddle through the 2 major reservoirs on the river because I'm not that much of a masochist, although I know there are people in the room who have done that. But other than that, I got to see the whole of that river, which changes a ton over its course. I saw a nearly 90-degree temperature swing over the course of my trip, from spring in Wyoming to summer in the desert. There are parts of that river that are class 4 rapids and canyons, and there are parts of it that are such long, boring pieces of flat water that nobody very smart paddles them very often. Sometimes I didn't see other people for days. I did most of it alone in that little boat because that gave me the most flexibility to shuttle and take care of myself and follow what felt interesting. I'd shove gear and food for anywhere from 2 to 10 days into the tubes of the boat, and then I'd alternate between being on the river paddling and getting off to interview and talk to people along the way to get a sense of what was important to them and what was happening along the river's course. When I started out, it felt like the logistics were going to be the hardest part, especially figuring out where I could get on and off the river and what flows might be and timing. But all those pieces really came together on the trip. And again, I'm totally happy to talk about that at happy hour. But the hard part was really figuring out the story. So I started up in those headwaters in Wyoming in May, and it was cold, and I was nervous about all the pieces of my trip. Would I get a hole in my boat? Would I stay on a timeline? Would I get hurt? And most importantly, would people want to talk to me? And the first thing I wanted to talk about was agriculture, because that's what the vast majority of the water is used for up there. And I got the number of this guy named Albert, whose family had been ranching in the area for generations, and who said he was willing to talk and show me around his property. And I will tell you that one of the best parts of my job is that it gives me permission to be nosy and to call up random people to see if they will let me come see their lives. And this is my first journalism tip, which I think is actually helpful in all sorts of places. For the most part, people like to talk about themselves, and if you ask them to share their stories, they often will. Curiosity can get you pretty far. So Albert invited me out to his property, and we go out side by side, bouncing out over his fields, which are just starting to get green. And I always try to do as much research as I can ahead of time because I want to know what's important to talk about. But I still managed to inadvertently ask him some pretty basic and borderline invasive questions. I stuck my foot in my mouth a couple of times. But he was incredibly kind and gracious as we were out there. And after a while, because we were talking about water, he started talking about things like native species migration and aquifer recharge and all these other things that were happening on his land. And we talked about how water was tied to the history of his family there and to the economics and to the ways he saw drought changing things over time. And right away, that busted some of my assumptions about what we were going to talk about and about what was important to him and what our common ground might be. He gave me a different, more holistic perspective, and I had to shed my own misconceptions and open up my own lens because of what I encountered right off the bat on my first stop on the river. And that happened with nearly everyone I talked to, from city water managers to tribal water lawyers. Everybody's scope was big and complicated and true to their own experience. Nothing was black and white. And I think it's easy to say that, but I didn't feel that until I was out there seeing the complexity of other people's lives in person. And so I'm bumping down the river, going through parts of Wyoming I'd never seen before, and pretty soon I hit a dam. And Fontenelle Dam, which is up in those pictures, is the first major dam on the river. It was initially intended to store water for irrigation, but it's hard to grow food up there. There's not much of a season. So it was redesigned for storage and power generation. And coming in, I had some assumptions about it. But I figured I had to do my due diligence and understand it because it was a big part of how that river gets used and managed. And I also assumed that I would have to go through loopholes and official government channels to get access to the dam. But I found the phone number of the guy who operated the power plant, and I called him up, and instead of sending me to a press office or something like that, he answered my call right away. And when I asked if we could talk, he was like, "Sure, I can show you the dam. can you be here in half an hour? I can open the gate. So I cruised right in, and like I said, people often like to talk about their lives, and he was proud of his job and happy to talk about it. He took me around and showed me how things worked, and one of the things he talked about a lot was this idea of balance. And he saw his job as being a balance point between what was happening upstream of him and what happened downstream, both in the short term and in the long term. He saw releasing water as a way to work in both of those systems and timeframes. And it put a picture into my mind, and I'm sure many of you have seen this graphic. It's one that comes up a lot in my world. I actually had it up on the wall in my bathroom for a little while. And it's two different images of the river system. One as a flowing river, and one as a series of funnels with all the reservoirs marked out with how big those are. And there's a huge visual disparity between those two images, but they are also the exact same thing. And I think often a lot of the work along the river is aligning those two images. And at the dam, he gave me some insight into how tricky but important that was for him, and about how he was trying to make the numbers of allocation work while also accounting for all these things that couldn't be quantified. And that helped me understand, in a little nutshell, a lot about the whole river. And that feels true in so many places. That balance is this ephemeral, hard to pin down thing that's also pivotal and crucial. And maybe that sounds all nice and rosy, right? We just need to find some kind of balance. But as I'm sure everybody in this room knows, it is never that easy. And I saw that on the river too. I nearly saw people come to blows over water, and that was at its most violent during my trip because of fish. While I was in Utah, I was off the river for a little bit because of how permit timing worked. And I was in Vernal, Utah, talking to folks, and someone mentioned that there was a meeting I should probably go to if I wanted to understand what was going on there. So that night, I showed up to this public meeting at the Vernal Rec Center that the Bureau of Reclamation was putting on to explain fish flows. And just for some background on that landscape, they release a pulse flow out of Flaming Gorge Dam to try to align with native fish spawning. I know some folks from the program are here today. To try to give those fish a chance to reproduce. It mimics pre-dam flows. And that year, it had been a really rainy spring. There was already a lot of water moving through the river, but they were still releasing the pulse when the fish were spawning, in part because it's in line with the Endangered Species Act. And that pulse flooded out some already saturated places, and people were angry about that. And at the meeting, they were, sitting in groups with people who thought like them with their arms crossed. And fishing guides were mad because it had hurt their business. Ag producers were mad because they'd lost crops. Some people were mad about wasting water. Some people were mad because they felt like the fish had priority over people. The scientists were trying to explain what they had done and why. And there was so much anger in this room. It kind of felt like the fish were a microcosm for some deeper issues that were going on. There was a lot of yelling at the meeting. I was sitting behind this family who was talking about how much money they stood to lose, and they were maybe joking about punching somebody. They were really hurt, and I think that everyone felt misunderstood and wronged. But slowly, over the night, as people talked and said their piece, the tension diffused. The anger didn't go away, but I think that as folks in the room heard other people's perspectives and got to share their stories, they felt more understood. They could start to trust people who thought differently than they did, even if they didn't necessarily agree. And that kind of trust is incredibly hard to make happen on a broad scale. That happened in that room that night, in large part because we were in the same room. I think there's real value in sharing space with people who might think differently than you do, like we might be doing today and this week. I actually really don't think we get enough of that these days. And there are some pieces I took away from that meeting that helped me understand the whole story. And this is where the journalism stuff comes in. First, I learned in a very tangible way that multiple things can be true at once. My therapist says that too all the time, but it's not just true about water. But that became abundantly clear on the river. As I went downstream, everything that I learned made the picture more complicated. In a lot of ways, I came out with more questions than I had when I started. And pretty much everyone was saying essentially the same thing, They wanted to protect the place they lived and their livelihood. They were thinking long term. No one had their head in the sand about how things were changing. Everyone was seeing variability. But the difference was in the details. What Albert cared about was different than what the fish biologists were saying. And that made it a harder story to tell. I think storytelling, and really any kind of communication, is two parts. It's gathering information, which I call reporting, and which is what the trip was. And then it's distilling and sharing it, doing the actual writing. And the first part is usually pretty fun, even if it's sometimes uncomfortable. And the second part is agonizing, because good writing, and really any kind of good explaining or planning, comes from hard thinking, especially if you're writing about something interesting and complex. I often think about it as becoming a funnel. As a writer, I'm compressing all this information to make what I've learned out in the field cogent and understandable for a reader. But you have to start really broad. You can only get the story right if you're putting everything into the funnel first, which is why the compression can be hard. And then you have to simplify it down, because you can't just spray out everything. It takes judgment and balance, like the dam operator said. Not everything can go through at once. And the second thing, and I think this is the most important thing, if you all remember anything from today, I hope that it's this, and that is that you don't have anything if you don't have your facts right. This is the most basic tenet of journalism, the world that I come from, but I think it applies to any kind of communication where you're trying to convey information. Your reader has to trust you to follow you through the story, and readers usually have pretty good bullshit detectors. I know that as a reader, I don't like being talked down to, I don't like the writer making assumptions about me, and I don't like being fed something that doesn't feel right or complete. And this is where the funnel can get tight and backed up, especially when there's a lot of facts to push through it, and especially when some of them contradict each other. But I think there are a few ways you can gain trust and try to get things as right as possible. The first is to show your work, to give the proof. And this applies in stories the same way it applies in math. You show how you arrived at your conclusion, you cite your sources, you give your readers a verifiable path to follow as you go along. Sometimes I think of it like giving them breadcrumbs to show them my trail. You can't just expect them to blindly go along with you. You have to make it make sense. And the second is to challenge your own biases and to look at all sides of the story, to be a reliable narrator and somebody they want to follow. I had to do this all the time, in the reporting part and in the writing part. I had to stop myself and say, why do I think this? How can I back it up? And what are the pieces I'm missing? Because I wanted the book to be as watertight as possible. As a writer, my words are my credibility. So I didn't want any of my blind spots to get in the way of the story. And those blind spots can be really hard to see because they're your blind spots. But challenging those ideas that might feel entrenched to you is how you get people to trust you. It's how you cut through the bullshit. I wanted the book to stand up. I wanted it to be durable, but I also wanted it to be flexible. And that idea was something I heard echoed a lot on the river, and it's something I'm hearing a lot these days too. Things are changing. We have to be flexible in the face of that, and we can't just rely on history and old stories. And we haven't really talked yet about narrative and plot, which are important parts of storytelling. And I will just mention that if you're ever trying to write a book or a story, you could do a lot worse than a river trip as a narrative, because it very conveniently starts in one place and ends in another. It's a really clean story arc, and it's a nice metaphor for change. But it can be tricky too, because of course, one river trip is one season, one water year, one particular administration, one experience. That cliche about never stepping in the same river twice is totally true. And that makes it hard to write something that's both specific and that will hold up over time. It's hard to pin down something that's constantly changing. By the time I got to the confluence with Colorado, I was pretty overwhelmed by how much I had to fit in. And as I tried to funnel all the things I learned into one cogent, cohesive story, I thought a lot about that idea of balance that had come up upstream. I thought about how I couldn't bring in every single thing that I learned, and about how this book, no matter how hard I tried, would be imperfect. And I had to be okay with that. I had to learn to be flexible, to adapt my storytelling to what was happening and changing on the ground, and to let old stories go. I also had to leave room for what could change and happen in the future. It was obviously going to be imperfect, but I could try to make it balanced and fair and full of the truth. And this trip and this story is my little piece of the river, but of course the story is so much bigger than one trip or one place or one state or one basin. And that feels very present to me here today when we're in a room with so many different perspectives and so much to figure out. The people in this room, all of you guys, are currently writing the story of the next phase on the river, of life and livelihoods in this river basin and so far beyond. That might sound hyperbolic, that might sound like some kind of a story, but it's true. And doing that takes creativity and vision and flexibility and stepping in other people's shoes and trying to predict the future. It takes thinking about the math and thinking about the fish. It will take a lot of aligning truths that seem to contradict each other. And like any good story, it's imperative not to forget history and to get the facts right, to make sure that everyone's voice is heard. I'm not saying that's easy, you all know that, but this is a chance to shape the story going forward. Thank you all so much for what you're doing.
Thank you, Heather. That's quite a story. Appreciate you sharing that. There's quite a few things there that we can learn from, certainly. I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, Rhett Larson, who is professor of water law at Arizona State University. I'll give you a little bit of information here on Rhett. Rhett's the Richard Morrison Professor of Water Law at Arizona State University's Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law. He's also a senior research fellow with the Kyle Center for Water Policy at ASU's Morrison Institute for Public Policy. He serves on Arizona's Water Infrastructure Finance Authority's Water Conservation Committee and the Arizona-Mexico Commission. He's also legal counsel to the Arizona Municipal Water Users Association. I wanted to point out a couple of things that Rhett is involved with that really impressed me. And it goes beyond just the small world that we work in here on Colorado River. He's a principal investigator on the USAID-funded applied research project for improving water supply for refugee host communities in Lebanon and Jordan. Professor Larson is also a visiting professor at and Fulbright scholar at the, now Rhett, you'll have to forgive me if I get this wrong, Pontifical Catholic University of Ecuador. Okay. A Plus Alliance visiting fellow at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, Australia. Lady Davis Fellow and visiting professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And he's, on top of all of those things, an author. And he's written the book, Just Add Water, Solving the World's Problems Using Its Most Precious Resource. And then there's another book coming out that Rhett is working on. And this might be extra relevant to us on the Colorado River. We hope not, if we all chase powder like we want to be. Day Zero. How cities run out of water. So with that, this next session will be a set of baseline foundational elements that Rhett is going to walk us through. It is the Colorado River History 101, going from back to time immemorial with the tribal presence through the preparation of the 07 guidelines. And then following Brett, after our break this afternoon, we've got a session that will go through the more recent history from the 07 guidelines through where we are today. So with that, Rhett, please let's give him a hand and welcome him to the stage.
that was very intense walk-up music for what I was about to do. They were playing Coolio's Gangster Paradise a little earlier, and I was like, if that is my walk-up music, that is amazing. Thank you so much, Bart, for the very kind introduction. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks to all of the organizers and the staff who make this happen. It is wonderful to see so many friends and colleagues as well. It's also wonderful to see so many of you who we look at each other in the hallways and we're like, I know I've met that person. I know that we know who. There was a guy in line at breakfast this morning and we were eyeing each other the entire time. Like, we definitely know each other, but I'm afraid to walk up and say anything. That's real brotherhood right there. Thanks very much to Vice President Garcia as well for his prayer. It reminded me of an experience my family had a few years ago where my daughter was saying the blessing on the food, and during her prayer she said, and please bless that it will stop raining so I can go outside and play. And you felt the whole dinner table tense up. And then when she said amen, I looked at her and I said, don't you ever say that again. In this house, we pray for rain. My wife was like, you got to dial it way down, Chief. A little more, just to let you get to know me a little bit better, is I'm from Yuma, Arizona. So if you're wondering, there we go, right, hometown. So if you're ever wondering, like, how does a guy get that into the Colorado River? You grow up in Yuma, Arizona, you get really into the Colorado River. Give you a sense of why people. So I understand that this is a tough talk to give because I know who I'm talking to. I am talking to some of the most advanced experts in Colorado River law and policy and history, but I know that there are at least a few of you out there who could use a primer to know what in the world we're all talking about. So hopefully I say something that is useful to all of you, or if nothing else, I say something a little funny and we'll all have a good time. But principally, why is everybody so nervous right now? Why is this conference such a big deal? Now, hopefully that photograph is a pretty good illustration of why people are so concerned. The river has changed a lot in the coming years. Most of the history I'm about to give you is history of lots of ups and downs, but it leads us right up to the beginning of the current crisis that we are in. But long story short, we're learning to live with a much smaller river. Sometimes people ask me about water law, and I tell people water law actually has a lot in common with bankruptcy law. There's a pool of resources to which lots of people have a legal claim, and the point of water law is to decide how that resource pays out if it can't pay out to everyone. So in a lot of ways, the changing river has resulted in a bankrupt river, and a lot of the arguments that we're having right now, they sound a lot like a bankruptcy dispute. Now, really quickly, just for those of you who are new to the conference and new to these conversations, you're going to hear acre-foot all the time. An acre-foot is, about 326,000 gallons of water. It's 1,233 cubic meters. It is the amount of water held in 1 acre flooded to 1 foot deep. It's about the amount of water that a household of 3 uses in a given year. If right now you're going, why in the world are they measuring it this way? Because this is America. And in America, we measure things in the weirdest possible way. If there is a weird, counterintuitive way to measure something, we will get 20 rods to the hogshead if that's what it takes. Now, the Colorado River's history begins generations and generations, eons ago, with the indigenous people who were the first nations to manage this resource. These indigenous nations have been managing the resource for time immemorial with an enormous amount of expertise and familiarity. That expertise and familiarity has been passed on in cultural, religious traditions in ways that still remain extremely relevant to the understanding of the river. What I hope people maybe a little hard for you all to see, but these are just a small number of the national seals of several of the tribal nations in the Colorado River Basin. One thing that's each one of these seals has in common, and many of the other seals also have in common, is a depiction of the river and how central the river is to their culture and to their understanding of their own society. And the river's relevant to many of these communities in a lot of ways. The Colorado River forms a part of the sacred geography of the Dene, of the Navajo Nation. That river's been a part of their conception of sacred balance and an important way that they understand the world. For the Hopi people, it remains part of their origin story. And for the Kitchon, for the Yuma people, it remains an important part of their ceremonial songs. Just an absolutely critical way for us to understand this resource. Now, Importantly, the Hohokam people, an ancient people who thrived around 500 AD, running up to about 900 AD, but there's a little more time on either side of that. One of the most advanced hydrologic societies in the ancient world, a remarkable group of water engineers. We still depend and rely upon their genius in managing the river in the Salt River Basin. And you might ask yourself, well, how could such a technologically advanced, engineeringly sophisticated, thriving desert nation collapse? The story is actually rather complicated. The story has at least a little bit to do with water variability. There's definitely evidence that a lot of the check dams that were built and their infrastructure were destroyed by floods. There's some evidence of them struggling with drought. But very importantly, a lot of the compelling evidence for the collapse of the Hohokam society is their failure to effectively manage salt. These were some of the best water managers that you could possibly imagine, but for every acre foot of Colorado River that was getting put on some of these rivers, they were putting a literal ton of salt in their soil. And that salt in the soil gradually built up until the soil became toxic. So it's one of the important elements of this is that we understand that salinity remains an important part of the challenge that we all deal with. One of the other things I want to just mention before we move on, which is in all of our conversations and negotiations about the Colorado River, one of the things I find that's very common in any water negotiation is we are destined for failure in our management efforts if we take for granted the cultural and political meaning of the river. Water is just a different resource, right? Water has all of the characteristics of gold and oil and uranium. It is a valuable, saleable, natural resource. But it also has all the characteristics of poetry and music and faith and politics. And we don't throw lumps of coal at each other in the wintertime, and we don't squirt each other with gasoline in the summertime, and nobody's using uranium to get baptized. It's just a different resource, and taking that uniqueness of water for granted or excluding it from our conversations means that these negotiations end up being destined for failure. As we all know, particularly in the Colorado River, we have to be sensitive to the political meaning of the river. Speaking of the political meaning of the river, the world's like a great big golf ball. It's a big sphere covered in divots. Every divot is a river basin surrounded by a watershed within which all water drains to a common point. If you were to draw the ideal jurisdictional map of the world, at least for purposes of managing water resource, you would draw every jurisdictional boundary to correspond to the watershed. So every country would just be the country of a river basin. That way you would size jurisdiction just right? You'd get a Goldilocks approach. Jurisdiction gets too big, you have too many people making decisions about the river, too many of those people are too remote from the river and unfamiliar with it. Make the jurisdictions too small, too many jurisdictions within a river basin, you're just bound for conflict because there's going to be lots of externalities. Size the jurisdiction just right, have it correspond to the watershed, and you resolve a lot, not all, but a lot of water challenges. And this was the idea of John Wesley Powell when he was sent by Congress, informally in 1869, more formally in 1871 and 1872, to survey the Colorado River Basin. His efforts ultimately resulted in a report back to Congress, his report saying water is going to be the principal challenge within this river basin, and what you need to do is draw state boundaries that correspond to the watershed. If you do not do that, Congress, you will be sowing a history of conflict and litigation. And Congress, being Congress, heard really good advice and did the opposite. And they did what is bound to cause conflict, and this is true all over the world. When you decide to break up property, whether it's two neighbors owning land or it's two countries with their individual sovereignty, the minute you make the boundary line between them a river, you've just guaranteed that they are going to get on each other's nerves and get in lots of fights. And that's absolutely what ended up happening. Now, it is politically infeasible to create the nation or the state of the Colorado River Basin. But the closer we can come to approximating that, the closer we can come to unity, like we are all citizens of one basin, the better we're going to get at managing the river. Now, really quickly, prior appropriation. I don't want to drive you nuts by teaching you all of water law, though it's really that much fun. Prior appropriation, first in time, first in right. So most of the western United States recognizes prior appropriation as the basis of its water law. First person to get there, pull the water out of the river, put a certain quantity of it to a beneficial use, has superior claim to anybody who comes after them. So this very, very simplified graphic. Somebody shows up in the late part of the 19th century, decides that they're going to divert water to irrigate corn, and then another party comes in 1970, decides they're going to divert water to mine for copper. Let's say that each one diverts 10 acre-feet. In 1 year, there's 3 acre-feet in the river. Person who got there first gets all 3 acre-feet. In 1970, person gets nothing. 1 year, there's 12 acre-feet. First person gets 10 acre-feet. The next person gets 2 acre-feet. Now imagine that complexity, but it's stretched out over thousands of square miles and thousands of people. Now it gets more complicated than that, but a lot of it has to do with priority, quantity, diversion point, and beneficial use. And those tend to be the aspects that we think of when we think of this approach to water management. Now, a lot of people criticize prior appropriation. They're like, well, this is a stupid way to run things. Prior appropriation is a great water policy if your aim is to settle a desert. It's not a great water policy if your aim is to manage a desert. So when this policy was initially enacted, it was enacted principally for 2 reasons. Number one is most of the eastern United States recognizes riparian water rights, where water rights are pertinent to the land. If you have water rights that are pertinent to the land, but you have a growing mining community in the western United States, they need to take the water from where it is and move it to where the ore body is. So old school riparian rights didn't work for miners in the western United States. They needed a new kind of water law. So they had a water law where the water wasn't pertinent to the land like it is in the eastern United States. The second reason is that the federal government saw all of this raw, undeveloped frontier land and thought, how do you get a lot of smart, hardworking people to go into that land and invest and develop? You just turn it into a race. You say, if you run as fast as you can into the desert and grab the most valuable resource you can possibly own in the desert, you'll own that resource. When they turned it into a race, it worked great. A lot of really smart, hardworking people ran into the middle of the desert and started developing. It's a great way to build a desert, not a great way to manage a desert. Now, when I say prior appropriation, hopefully some of you are thinking, well, prior appropriation, that's dynamite. That means Native American tribes, they're right at the front of the line. Kind of. The way it works in the United States is there's a doctrine called the Winters Doctrine. The Winters Doctrine says that every single reservation of federal land, whether it's a reservation of tribal land or whether it's a reservation of a military base or a national forest, implicit within that reservation is enough water to meet the primary purpose of that reservation. The purpose of the reservation for a tribal reservation is to establish a permanent homeland. How much water does it take to establish a permanent homeland? 1963 in Arizona v. California, the Supreme Court said it is their practicably irrigable acreage, or it's the amount of water that they can economically irrigate. Now, that's controversial. For some tribes, it's great. If you're the Colorado River Indian tribes or the Gila River Indian community and you've got a lot of really fertile soil and a big, fat, beautiful river running through your land, quantifying based on irrigation acres, fantastic. That's a lot of water. If you're the Walupai Nation and you're in the Grand Canyon and the water's way down at the bottom of the canyon and you care a lot about developing ecotourism, practically irrigable acres might not be a great way for you to quantify your water rights. So it creates challenges, which is something important I want to make sure to emphasize, which is sometimes you will hear people in the Colorado River Basin say, the tribes think this, or the tribes want that. Our tribes are exceptionally diverse. The tribes of the Colorado River Basin are diverse linguistically, they're diverse ethnically, they're diverse hydrologically, they're diverse economically, and they are united in many ways. Much of the law aligns their interests, but in some ways they're just as pitted against each other as any other jurisdiction. They are internally just as complex as any political entity, and they have their own water rights disputes that predate colonization between them. So it's one thing to always keep in mind is the diversity of the tribes within the basin. Now, I've talked a little bit about how much water they get. What's their priority? Where are they in line? If it's first in time, first in right, aren't they first in line? Kind of. Generally speaking, there's ways in which this is a little more nuanced, but generally speaking, a tribe's priority date is the date of their reservation. For most of the tribes in the Colorado River Basin, the date of their reservation is in the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century, early 20th century. It puts them at or near the front of the line. So they have very senior water rights. That is not true for every tribe in the basin, however. There are tribes that did not become federally recognized until the 1970s, and that, relative to a lot of other water users, is a very junior water right. Now, many tribes engage in settlement negotiations. It's a hassle to be able to litigate these claims. It creates an enormous amount of uncertainty. And so for a lot of tribes, the idea is, listen, we'll give up some of the water we might be entitled to under these laws, and what we'll get in exchange is some funding for water infrastructure so that we can turn this paper water into wet water, authorizations to be able to lease some of this water off reservation so that we can monetize some of this water, maybe a moratorium on pumping around our land, and maybe we can reach a deal. Many tribes within the Colorado River Basin have reached settlement agreements. Many of these settlement agreements happen under the shadow of general stream adjudications. These are large, multi-party adjudications of water rights across a state. They tend to take a long time, and so tribes want to get out of them. So this induces a lot of settlement. Right now, there are settlement proposals in front of Congress for the Navajo Nation, the Hopi tribe, and the San Juan Southern Paiute, as well as probably reintroduced legislation for the settlement of the Yavapai Apache Nation as well. Now, interstate water law. How do states generally share water when they get in a fight with each other? One thing states can do is they can just sue each other. One of my pet peeves, because I'm a water law scholar, is I'm around a lot of snooty law professors. And some of the snooty constitutional ones will be like, oh, you water law. This is a very narrow niche area. And I'm like, oh, brother. And then they'll go, oh, does the US Supreme Court ever hear any water law claims? And I'm like, yeah, like all the time, because when two states sue each other, the United States Supreme Court has original jurisdiction, and they get to hear that claim without any appeal. And what the two states or multiple states sue each other over a lot? Water. So they sue each other all the time. So this ends up going to the United States Supreme Court under their original jurisdiction. The US Supreme Court applies their own doctrine called equitable apportionment to split up the river. As you can imagine, it's an awfully nerve-wracking thing for two states who don't have a compact to sue each other and have it go to 9 judges, only one of which has ever lived west of the Mississippi in their entire life, to make decisions about how to manage that river. Now, oftentimes, the US Supreme Court will appoint a special master, and they will be largely deferential to the special master, but that's scary too, because then the states are like, well, our water supply determinations have just been put in the hand of some one person. So it can be a really scary thing. Now, state law has been a guiding principle, but it isn't determinative in equitable apportionment. So if two states sue each other and it goes to the United States Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court won't just apply equitable apportionment, or they won't just apply prior appropriation. This was really important in the development of the Colorado River, because in the early part of the 20th century, states started suing each other, and the US Supreme Court said, hey, listen, if it's just 2 states that follow prior appropriation, we'll just apply prior appropriation to them. So if Wyoming and Montana sue each other, we'll just apply prior appropriation between the 2 states. That's how we'll solve the problem, since they use prior appropriation internally. And that freaked everybody out in the Colorado River Basin. If you want to know why 1922 was the year of the compact happened, it's because it followed on the heels of 2 US Supreme Court decisions that said, we're going to recognize prior appropriation in interstate disputes, and everyone in the Colorado River said, that's terrible, because California's growing so fast, they're going to gobble up the whole river before we've had a chance to get into the game. We need to get out of the business of prior appropriation. Now, another possibility is you can just go knock on Congress's door and do congressional apportionment. Congress, why don't you just pass legislation that splits up the river amongst us? Sounds great, but it's not. There's lots of reasons why that's not a great idea, but one of the main reasons why it's not a great idea is there's almost always within a river basin something we call the hydrohegemon. There's usually some jurisdiction that's got a lot of political power, it's got a lot of economic power, it's got a larger congressional delegation, and so if you go to Congress and it just turns into who's got the money and who's got the votes, it's a hard way to divide up a river equitably, which leads us to option number 3, and that is compact apportionment. What if the states come together with a constitutionally authorized process to reach a compact agreement? Then we'll create a compact that acts like a treaty between the states, and that'll split up the water amongst us. And you're like, oh, that's fantastic. It gets us out of all the nervousness of the Supreme Court, and it gets us out of all the politics of Congress. No. Because, first of all compacts have to be approved by Congress, so Congress gets into the game either way. And also, guess what happens when 2 states sue each other over how to interpret the compact? United States Supreme Court. So while it has lots of virtues, in some ways, it's got the worst of both worlds. Now, one more thing to mention really quickly, which is the Dormant Commerce Clause. This is the idea that since the federal government gets to manage the way that states buy and sell and trade between them, states can't throw up trade barriers between them. You can't ban selling things to California. Now, one of the exceptions to that is if there is police power that you're trying to conserve something that's critical to taking care of your citizens, or if the particular thing is not an article of commerce. And one of the big areas that's get very confusing and uncertain is water an article of commerce? And how much can states, exercising their police power, refuse to allow water to flow or be sold to another state? If you're paying attention right now, Colorado v. Nebraska is a brewing conflict, and a lot of that has to do with Nebraska's ability to go into Colorado and build diversions. So this is going to be another complex aspect of the way that states get along with each other on the river. Now, sharing the Colorado rivers. Now we're getting into the real specifics of the river. You'll hear people talk about the structural deficit a lot. Let me summarize the structural deficit. 1922, we have the Colorado River Compact, coming on the heel of all of these controversies within the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, on the heel of that controversy, the compact does something relatively simple. Sometimes when people talk about the compact, they're like, oh, it's this big complex document, it does lots of things. The law of the river is exceptionally complex. The compact itself is not that complex. It splits up the river basin at Lee Ferry with the upper basin and the lower basin. The upper basin being New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, a little tiny bit of Arizona, the lower basin being Nevada, Arizona, and California, and then flowing down into Mexico. The upper basin has the obligation to provide 75 million acre feet, or cannot cause the depletion of 75 million acre feet over the average span of 10 years. Long story short, it works out to about 7.5 million acre feet every year to the upper basin, about 7.5 million acre feet every year to the lower basin. 1944, we guaranteed 1.5 million acre feet to Mexico. Every year, we lose about 1.5 million acre feet to evapotranspiration. Add it all together, 7.5 plus 7.5 plus 1.5 plus 1.5, you get 18 million acre feet. So the whole law of the river assumes that every single year in the river, there's 18 million acre feet to satisfy everyone. We know from tree ring analysis that the average amount of water in the river over 1,000 years is closer to 13.5 million acre feet. So even if you waved a magic wand and made climate change disappear in reverse, the river's still bankrupt based on its history. It's still guaranteeing more, the law still guarantees more water than the normal river can pay out. Now, climate change makes this problem worse. It makes it harder, because what climate change does is climate change means we get more frequent, more intense El Nino years. El Nino years you would think would be good, because typically El Nino years mean more precipitation in the winter. The problem is that our winters are getting very wet with more frequent, more intense El Ninos, but our winters are also short and hot. So we might get 110% of our normal snowpack, but the air is so hot and dry, our soil is so dry, that you might only get 60% that ever actually reaches the river. So our runoff has been affected. And that's how climate change is making an already difficult problem even more difficult. Now, obviously other issues like growing economies and population development, these are similar issues, but one of my pet peeves is when outsiders fly over our desert cities and they go, well, it's just unsustainable for these silly desert people to live in the middle of the desert. Listen, if your beef is with people building cities and growing food in the desert on desert river basin, your beef is with 10,000 years of human civilization, right? Like, it's normal to grow food and build cities in the desert. There's a reason that the first places we learned how to get along with each other outside of the context of family and tribe were on the banks of the Tigris, the Euphrates, the Nile, and the Indus. Desert rivers bring people together, and they help people cooperate. So it's a new innovation to live in all these cold places people are living in. Growing food and living in the desert, that's what human beings do. There you go. Now, let's talk a little bit more about this history as we go through it. Colorado River Compact, we've already talked about basically what it does. The Boulder Canyon Project Act rolls around in 1928. Arizona refused to sign the compact in 1922. They thought it was a Trojan horse that benefited California, so they stayed out of it. California said, well, if you guys aren't going to move forward, we're going to cast the Boulder Canyon Project Act. Boulder Canyon Project Act does a lot of things, including funding Parker Dam. It does some other things as well. It basically says, listen, Lower basin states, you chuckleheads get together and you have a compact, and that compact is going to split your 7.5 million acre feet up. 4.4 million acre feet a year to California, 2.8 to Arizona, 300,000 acre feet every year to Nevada. It does not make that allocation. It authorizes the states to enter into a compact that makes those allocations. Well, we just couldn't get along with each other, so that compact never ended up happening. California moves forward with the development of Parker Dam. Arizona has spies in the construction crew of Parker Dam. And when California crosses the river into Arizona to continue the construction, spies ride in from the construction into Phoenix to warn then Governor of Arizona, Benjamin Baker Moores, that California has invaded. Governor Moore was secretly building the Navy of Arizona to sail up the Colorado River and destroy Parker Dam and oust the invading Californians. Harold Ickes at the time, the Secretary of the Interior, caught wind of what Arizona was doing, marched troops out from Fort Huachuca to intercept the Arizonans and prevent a civil war. At the exact same time, Texas and Oklahoma were in an armed conflict over the Red River that had resulted in violence. In fact, martial law had been declared and Texas Rangers had been sent out to the river. And there's actually correspondence amongst generals of the Third Reich at the time saying that the United States will not enter into World War II because they're about to descend into a water-based civil war. I know! Fortunately, everybody's chilled out a lot since then, and that's why that's why we're so happy, and we're just like a snuggly little family now, and everybody's cool with everybody all the time. 1944 rolls around, another red letter year for the basin. The upper basin enters into a compact that allocates the upper basin's allocation based on a percentage of available stream flow. Very smart, right? Adapts immediately, rather than raw water allocations, adapts immediately to available stream flow. 1944 is also the year that we enter in to the Rivers Treaty with Mexico. 1963 rolls around, original jurisdiction, Arizona v. California. Not only does Arizona v. California recognize practicably irrigable acreage as the way that we split up water, but Arizona v. California says, you know, remember those allocations that were made in the Boulder Canyon Project Act? Deal with it. Those are the allocations now. So 4.4 for California, 2.8 for Arizona, 300,000 for Nevada. It also says that Arizona's tributaries don't count against it for the quantification of their mainstream water rights. Now along comes 1968 and the Colorado River Basin Project Act. What happens in the Colorado River Basin Project Act is Arizona looks at this wonderful 2.8 million acre foot right that they've gained under Arizona v. California and says that doesn't do us that much good if we can't get all of that water to where all of our people live. They all live in central Arizona or in and around Phoenix and Tucson. So we need infrastructure to bring water from our western border into central Arizona. We don't have enough money. The only person who doesn't have enough money is the federal government, and the only way to get the federal government on board is to go hat in hand to California. So we go hat in hand to California, and we say, hey, California, will you guys back us in legislation that will authorize financing the Central Arizona Project, a big canal that will bring on some portion of our water into Central Arizona? And California says, absolutely we will do that. In exchange for your immortal soul. They're like, yeah, we'll make you a deal, but here's the deal. If the river hits shortage, you chumps are junior on the river when it comes to the lower basin. So if there's shortage on the river, the cuts come from the Central Arizona Project. Now, this is sort of the superficial story that we tell ourselves, but if you read the 1968 Project Act very carefully, it says that junior priority only remains true unless and until the federal government augments to the point that Mexico's supply is taking care of augmentation. If that ever happens, then Arizona ceases to be junior to California. So sometimes when we talk about the challenges of augmentation policy, boy, desalination's really expensive. Boy, transboundary water movements are really costly. Boy, advanced water purification, that's really expensive. When we talk about how the challenges of augmentation, we should always factor in, there's a chance that it can resolve a lot of these lower basin disputes. The other important thing that the 1968 Act did is it said the obligation to Mexico is a national obligation. So the compact said, hey, listen, if we ever have a treaty with Mexico someday, here's the way we're going to work it out. If we have a treaty with Mexico, Mexico gets any water that's surplus to satisfy their 1.5 million acre foot right. But if there isn't any surplus, then any deficiency will be satisfied equally between the two basins. And that's all the compact says. But the 1968 Act says it's a national obligation that we all have to be a part of it. So how can it be a national obligation if satisfying Mexico's 1.5 million acre foot claim to the river is all done on the backs of the Central Arizona Project? That doesn't sound like a national obligation. That sounds like pain that's just getting dumped on a very small number of users. Now, this gives you a sense of how things get split up. The percentages that are allocated in the Upper Basins Compact in 1944, and the raw water allocations recognized under the Boulder Canyon Project Act and recognized under Arizona v. California. Back really quick, because we skipped one really important thing, which is the Quantification Settlement Agreement. The QSA in 2003, this was an important part of managing the river for many years. California had gotten used to getting over 5 million acre feet a year because Arizona and Nevada hadn't grown fully into their allocations, and so California could dip into their neighbors' allocations. As things like the Central Arizona Project and other developments were happening, Arizona and Nevada started to use more and more of their water, and they started to say, hey, California, you need to get yourself down to 4.4 million acre feet. California said, hey, listen, we've been getting more than 5 million acre feet for a long time, asking us to just do this right away, that's pretty tough. The US federal government, the Bureau of Reclamation, said, listen, you find a glide path agreement amongst you that allows California to get itself down over time to 4.4 million acre feet, or we're just going to step in and start making cuts. And guess what happened? We reached the QSA. The QSA ended up getting negotiated between the lower basin states, which allowed California to have a sort of glide path down to getting down to its 4.4 million acre foot right. It allowed for a large ag to urban transfer from the Imperial Irrigation District into San Diego. It required certain conservation requirements within the irrigation districts, including lining canals. It allocated the water rights specifically to the Imperial Irrigation District, its 3.1 million acre foot right, and resolved a lot of issues. The thing I want to emphasize in this story is, what was the catalyst? How did such an intractable problem ultimately result in a multi-state agreement? The US Bureau of Reclamation made a threat and said, if you don't get your act together, here's something you're not gonna like. And it pulled everybody together. Was that subtle? So, importantly, there are lots of large-scale water transports across the basin, both in the upper basin, things like the Colorado Big Thompson, in the lower basin, like the Central Arizona Project that I mentioned, or movements through the Colorado River Aqueduct into Metropolitan Water District, or movements from the All-American Canal into the Imperial and Coachella Valleys for farming. So there are lots of ways in which large-scale infrastructure is moving water through the basin. Let's talk about US-Mexico hydrodiplomacy. So, back in the olden days, Judson Harmon, who was the Attorney General under Grover Cleveland, he had what was called the Harmon Doctrine. The Harmon Doctrine basically said, a country can do whatever it wants to with its river, and it doesn't owe any of its downstream neighbors anything. So we can dam up the entire river, and even if it never reaches Mexico, that's fine, that's what we're allowed to do. And the Harmon Doctrine held in the United States of America for many decades thereafter, until something changed. Finally, in 1944, we reached the River Treaty. The River Treaty allocates water in a whole variety of ways across the entire border, but specifically makes the 1.5 million acre foot guarantee to Mexico. It also took what was at the time a commission that managed just border boundary issues, and turned it into CILA, the Comisión Internacional de Límites y Agua, or IBWC, the International Boundaries and Water Commission, which is one commissioner on each side managing these issues and implementing the treaty, able to implement minutes that allow the treaty to adapt quickly. Now, the IBWC was developed to be able to manage this issue across the entire border. All of this was done in 1944. Why 1944? Because the United States needed a secure ally to its southern border during World War II. There were overtures coming from Germany into Mexico, and the United States was like, we got to nip this in the bud. Hey, Mexico, what do you want? Water. Deal. Right? So how did Mexico, whenever you're looking at how things shift in our relationship, look to geopolitics, and it usually explains it. So, the 1922 Compact, as I mentioned, anticipated the idea of a treaty someday. Then we get into the 1944 treaty that creates IBWC, makes these guarantees. The 1968 Act makes the agreement, makes that commitment to Mexico a national obligation. 1974, in the 1970s, Mexico starts getting pretty mad. They're like, hey, The water that's crossing the border is between 2,500 and 3,000 parts per million total dissolved solid. It's just too salty, it's killing our crops. So they protested under the treaty. The United States said, hey, we're going to take care of this for you guys. We're going to pass the Salinity Control Act. We're going to address those salt issues. Don't you worry about a thing. Why did the United States do that in the 1970s? What's the geopolitical climate? It's the OPEC embargo, right? The United States looked to a southern neighbor that had oil and said, what do you guys want? And they said, less salty water. And they said, you guys got it if we get oil, right? So, Salinity Control Act built the Yuma desalting plant. There we go, another call out to my hometown. Built the Yuma desalting plant to desalinate the Colorado River. Yuma desalting plant was so expensive that we barely ever turn it on in all the years since it was built. How do we solve the salinity problem otherwise? We build big interceptor ditches that catch all that salt rolling off of all of that agricultural land and divert it to the Ciénaga de la Santa Clara wetlands in Mexico. It's, depending on the year, 113,000 acre feet a year. That's a lot of water. You run that through a desalination plant, we could get a lot of water, but it'd be pretty expensive. We'd also stop discharging the water to the wetland. It's a Ramsar-protected wetland that's the homeland of the Kokopah people with a lot of endangered and threatened species in it. That wetland will dry up if we stop diverting that water there. What's the answer? The answer is the thing that we all have to embrace, which is it is hard to solve water problems without causing harm to someone who doesn't deserve it. Water problems are that complicated that it is hard to come up with a solution that doesn't hurt somebody somewhere. The least that we can do is not wag our fingers at those people and tell them they're the villain, but to find ways to help them. Now, it also resulted later, as we get into the quantification settlement agreement, the lining of the All-American Canal, which infuriated northern Mexican farmers because they were getting all of that percolation from the All-American Canal that was flowing into Sonora. So the water table dropped once the canals were dropped. So that's the paradox of conservation, right? Sometimes you conserve yourself right into a problem, and that ended up happening there. Also, really quickly, I don't want to go into the depths of the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, but it is important for everyone to know our relationship with Mexico is really complicated. Because unlike lots of other international water relationships, we are both upstream and downstream of each other. So in the Nile Basin, it's a lot of fights between Egypt downstream against all of its upstream riparians. But our relationship with Mexico is such that we're downstream of them on the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, but upstream on the Colorado. And Mexico has repeatedly, despite honest efforts, breached its agreement for deliveries on the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo. To conflate these two challenges in these two river basins is a dangerous thing to do. Each one of these river basins is complex in and of itself with their own individual economies. To connect them to each other in the way that we manage them is going to make each individual problem that much more complicated. Now, how does the Colorado River get used? Colorado River, between 70 and 80%, depending on where you're at, is used by irrigated agriculture, applied to 15% of U.S. farmland, 90% of our winter vegetables. Now, you can always tell someone who knows almost nothing about the Colorado River when they say, it's because of all you dum-dums living there. We have largely disconnected growth from water supply at this stage. For many of our cities, the more we grow, the more efficient we get. So human population growth, while certainly a challenge, and you can grow in stupid ways that create water challenges, we have largely disconnected population growth from water consumption. Not entirely, but it's not the major driver. You can tell someone who knows a little bit about the Colorado River Basin, but not nearly enough to have an opinion when they go, just get rid of all the golf courses. Look, you can eliminate every single golf course in the Colorado River Basin, it wouldn't do anything, right? It would just have a lot of people lose their jobs, and no water problem would get solved. Now, you can tell somebody who knows enough about the Colorado River that they're getting an opinion, but not enough to have their opinion taken fully seriously when they go, why don't we just ban alfalfa? Alfalfa is 1.5 million acre feet across the basin every year. It's a very thirsty crop. It uses a whole lot of water, much more water than all the golf courses put together. So why isn't it just why don't we just say beneficial use means not alfalfa? Lots of reasons. One of those reasons goes back to salt. Alfalfa is a relatively salt-resilient crop that can thrive in saline conditions, and it's irrigated in a way that allows salt to be leached out of our soil so that we don't fall into the trap of not managing salt in our soil correctly. Also, it's got a really strong market from dairy and beef, so if we scale back on the production of alfalfa, you're going to feel it in the grocery store in your grocery bill. We can't just move this production to some other place. We grow food and fiber in the desert because of the climate, not despite the climate. This is a great place to grow food, and because it's a great place to grow food, you can get 11, 12 cuttings a year of alfalfa here. If you moved it to Georgia, you'd get 3. So if we tried to move it somewhere else, it would have huge impacts on our food security. Also, if you were trying to tell a farmer, well, why don't you just shift to a different crop? Why don't you just grow agave or guayule? Or why don't you just grow barley? Well, you need to attract certain industries like distilleries, like malt houses, like rubber manufacturers, if you want them to make that shift. But as long as there's a strong market for those farmers and they don't have the infrastructure to shift to other crops, including the kind of food safety and refrigeration infrastructure they might need to shift to direct foods consumed directly by consumers, then farmers are going to act rationally and they're going to grow alfalfa. So just saying waving your hand at alfalfa doesn't solve the problem. You got to think carefully about it. Now, I'm going to end with this last slide just to talk to you a little bit about some of my thoughts. What do I think about coming off of all of these? What are the lessons we learn? One really important lesson. Tribes are co-equal sovereigns. They're an important part of the way that we manage the river. Our failure to include tribes in the earliest stages of the negotiation of the compact creates challenges that exist to this day. Failure to include the voice of tribes now will just sow conflict and uncertainty in the future. So welcoming and encouraging tribal participation from jurisdictions with deep familiarity with the resource is an important part of the way that we're going to move forward. Second, Mexico is an important partner. Mexico has been a good, adaptive, flexible partner for us. They have allowed us to come up with creative solutions and have worked with us closely. Maintaining an amicable, supportive, positive relationship with our Mexican counterparts is critical to our management of the future of the basin, and they need to be brought in and have a voice as soon as possible. Pluses and minuses of litigation. Listen, I get a lot of people who are like, isn't the worst possible outcome of all of these conversations litigation? Wouldn't that be a catastrophe? Maybe. I'm not sure that there isn't a version of litigation that might not help. It's not our highest priority. Best thing is we all pull together, we come up with a great solution, we all bring our best efforts, and we come up with a solution. Maybe the next best solution is Bureau of Reclamation does what they did in the quantitative settlement agreement. They threaten us with something that makes us all unhappy, and that catalyzes us and pulls us together. But if there's litigation, sometimes people are like, litigation's bad. Listen, litigation has a place. Litigation's place is when parties are not effectively talking to each other and when people aren't internalizing the costs of refusing to make an agreement. At some point, you need litigation to force people to talk to each other and to make people pay the price of refusing to settle. If litigation becomes a catalyst for settlement, litigation can be positive. Texas v. New Mexico is a recent example of 2 states that sued each other over a shared river, and their lawsuit catalyzed ultimately a settlement. If litigation results in a rapid settlement, it can be a positive thing. But many, the vast majority, of interstate water disputes get bogged down, and they languish. And we cannot afford a bogged down, languished litigation in the U.S. Supreme Court. That is not going to help anyone. That is a catastrophe. But there's also another area where we're going to avoid litigation at all costs. So avoiding litigation at all costs means what if we just keep coming up with little Band-Aid solutions that kick the can down the road? That creates uncertainty for a lot of water resource managers. The best thing that we can provide right now is greater certainty, even if it's not the best kind of deal we can come up with. Water doesn't lend itself well to crisis management. It requires long-term planning, and so waiting until things get really bad before you take action is a bad way to manage this resource. I know for all of us, this is one of the really hardest parts about our job, which is how do we convey enough urgency that a lot of actors who aren't in this room feel provoked to change, to move. But urgency is a healthy thing. Panic is an unhealthy thing. And the thing I keep trying to tell people is, in the Colorado River Basin, we are not running out of water. We are running out of cheap water. That's what we're running out of. And that challenge, who's going to pay for what, isn't just in higher water rates, although that's probably part of it, but it's also the tough trade-offs that are going to have to happen, which is all of us are coming here to this conference today saying we want certainty and we want to resolve the conflict. And I believe that's true of every single person here. We want certainty and we want to resolve the conflict. But certainty and peace have a price. And one thing I've noticed, and not to go too broad, but even in the way that we talk to each other in our political discourse, is there's a lot of conversations that say that person started it, or that person is the worst actor. And it might be good to say, look internally and say, maybe I need to pull the beam out of my own eye before I try and pull the mote out of someone else's. What can I bring to the table that calms things down? What sacrifices can I bring that will help solve the problem? If you really value peace and certainty, now's the time to show how much you value it by what you're willing to sacrifice in order to get it. And the last thing I want to say is, we have enough water in the Colorado River Basin to do a lot of great things. But we don't have enough water in the Colorado River Basin to do every good thing. So I'm a dad with 4 kids. My kids, my 2 oldest are grown up now. They're making big decisions about college and careers, and they ask for my advice, and the advice I give them all the time is, life isn't about having all of your dreams come true. It's about having the most important ones come true. And I wanted to own a little avocado farm in the Dominican Republic and be a beach bum, but I wasn't going to get your mom that way. She's my dream. She's the dream I wanted to come true. And I had to give up a dream in order to get her. And I'm glad I did, because I got my most important dream. It's the same kind of hard decisions that we're coming up with now. We can make a lot of our biggest dreams come true if we decide what we want to be when we grow up. Thanks very much.